Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere quiet, somewhere with low stone walls, damp grass, and the distant sound of birds calling from the trees. You might not have experienced this before, but tonight we're spending a summer in the countryside where time slows down and even the crows seem to be keeping secrets. This one is personal. It's a memory I return to sometimes when I can't sleep, and I'm inviting you to come with me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that little bell if you haven't already. It helps us keep the stories coming, and it means the world to me. All right, now let's get into today's diary entry. The year was, well, I don't remember the exact year, just that I was around 11 or 12, and my parents had decided to send me off to stay with my uncle in Wales for the summer. They said it was so I could breathe country air and get out from behind screens for once. But I think they just needed some quiet time themselves. Either way, I ended up with a suitcase too big for the bus, a backpack full of comic books, and a pair of boots I didn't like the look of. My uncle lived in a stone house perched just beyond the edge of a sleepy village surrounded by rolling hills, sheep and fields that smelled like hay, and something older, something earthy and strange. The house had creaky floors and a fireplace that always seemed to be going even in July. The back door never closed properly, and the screen had a tear in it, so flies were frequent guests. I liked it though. It was different. I arrived in the middle of a rainstorm, that kind of sideways rain that makes everything shimmer and blur at the edges. Uncle Dafid, he insisted I call him Di, picked me up from the tiny local train station in a truck that looked like it had been borrowed from a museum. It wheezed the whole way up the road. "You'll get used to the quiet," he told me, squinting through the foggy windshield. "It listens better than people do." I didn't know what that meant at the time, so I just nodded and hugged my backpack tighter. The first few days passed slowly. My uncle didn't have a television, and the only radio in the house was always tuned to the weather or sheep auction reports. I read a lot, walked a bit, and tried to avoid chores. I started to learn the rhythms of the place: when the bees woke up in the garden, when the light turned golden near the barn, and how the wind always picked up at night, rattling the shutters just enough to keep me awake. There was one path behind the house I was told not to go near. It was marked with a sagging barbed wire fence half swallowed by hedges and moss. "Nothing there for you?" Uncle Di said the first time I asked. "Just woods and old things." That, of course, made me even more curious. One afternoon, while he was at the village shop picking up feed, I wandered to the edge of the yard with a half-eaten apple in my hand and spotted a crow perched on a fence post by the forbidden path. It was staring straight at me, head tilted. Then it cawed once and flew off down the overgrown trail. I hesitated. I wasn't scared exactly, just unsure, but the path tugged at me as if the whole summer had been quietly waiting for me to notice it. The first time I stepped through the gap in the fence, I felt like I had passed into a quieter kind of silence. The leaves muffled the world, and the smell of damp bark and wildflowers filled my nose. The trees arched overhead like a tunnel, and the air was thick with buzzing insects and birdsong. I thought I saw another crow deeper into the trees, and I followed it without thinking. That evening, my uncle asked if I'd been anywhere unusual. I said no, of course. But that night, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard crows. Not many, just one or two, softly cawing outside the window. The sound didn't frighten me. It made me curious. There was something watchful in the air, like the trees had opened their eyes and hadn't blinked since. The next day I went back. I didn't tell Uncle Day. I waited until he was busy tinkering with the old tractor and then took a loaf of bread and a notebook with me into the trees. I wanted to sketch the place. I was pretty good at drawing birds, at least in my mind I was. I wanted to see what the crows might do if I stayed long enough. I didn't expect what I saw instead. There, near a cluster of elder trees, was a girl, about my age, maybe a little older. She wore a white dress that hung like mist around her legs and was standing absolutely still in the clearing. Around her, no exaggeration, were at least a dozen crows. They weren't squawking or hopping about. They were just watching her, perched in branches, resting on stones, sitting on the ground like statues. She didn't see me, or if she did, she gave no sign. She lifted her hands slowly and the birds shifted their heads toward her. Then she spoke. I couldn't make out the words. It was more like a murmur, soft and low, almost like she was singing. The crows rustled their feathers but didn't move. One tilted its head as if replying. I must have made a sound, stepped on a twig, or breathed too loud, because suddenly she turned her head. And in that one glance, I felt as if she saw straight through me. Then she smiled. Just a little, and all the crows took off at once like smoke being pulled into the sky. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The kind of early where the light outside still has that bluish tint, and the dew hasn't even started to lift off the grass. I sat up in bed, the old quilt slipping to my lap, and I listened. No crows this time, just the distant hum of sheep in the far pasture and the creak of old floorboards settling. But my head was still full of her, the girl in the white dress. I kept trying to convince myself I hadn't imagined it. Maybe I'd just seen a local kid playing in the woods. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the memory of her calm voice, or how the crows had reacted to her like she was part of them. Like she belonged in that grove in a way I didn't yet understand. I didn't mention her to Uncle Di. He'd have laughed and said something about summer fancies. Instead, I ate breakfast quietly, staring out the kitchen window at the orchard beyond the back fence. I noticed a single black feather stuck in the grass by the gate. Not a big deal on a farm, but still, it felt like a sign. Around noon, Uncle Di went off to the neighboring farm to help with the broken gate. I waited until he was well down the road before pulling on my boots and heading back to the path behind the barn. This time it didn't feel like I was trespassing. The moment I ducked beneath the barbed wire and stepped onto the overgrown trail, it felt like the trees remembered me. Birds flitted between the branches, and I noticed more than one crow following me with their dark, glassy eyes. They didn't call, not yet, just watched. I took the same turns I had yesterday, trusting my feet more than my memory. The forest wasn't large, but it had a strange looping quality. Like the deeper you walked, the more it folded in on itself. Eventually, I reached the clearing again, though the girl wasn't there this time. Instead, I found something else. A small circle of stones deliberately placed in the center of the clearing. The kind of circle kids might use to pretend they were casting spells or holding secret meetings. In the middle of it lay a smooth, flat rock with a spiral etched into the surface. It looked old, too clean to have been carved recently. I crouched beside it, not sure if I should touch it, but unable to resist. The stone was warm, though there was no sun reaching through the thick canopy. As I traced the spiral with my finger, I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, wings. I turned around slowly. There she was again, standing just at the edge of the clearing in the exact same dress, barefoot. Her hair was longer than I remembered, or maybe it just looked that way. And again, she was surrounded by crows. 3 on the ground beside her, one perched casually on her shoulder like it belonged there. This time she looked directly at me. "You came back," she said softly. Her voice sounded like wind through tall grass. Not airy, but gentle. Old in a way I couldn't explain. I nodded. Yeah, I wanted to see this place again. She tilted her head, not quite smiling. "They remember you." I glanced at the birds. One of them blinked slowly as if acknowledging me. I felt oddly honored, like I'd been granted an audience. "What's your name?" I asked. She paused. "Lowry. It suited her, sounded local old-fashioned. I'm a serene toxic. I know, she said, cutting me off. Not rudely, just matter of fact. You're the boy from the stone house. You read a lot. You draw. That startled me. Have you been watching me? She shrugged, looking down at the crow on her shoulder. They tell me things. I opened my mouth to ask what things, but she turned and walked deeper into the trees, crows flapping into the branches above her. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to follow, but something in the air had shifted. The warmth from the stone faded, replaced by a cooler breeze that carried the scent of river water and wild mint. She was gone before I could speak again. I stayed in the clearing for another hour trying to draw the spiral stone in my notebook, but my pencil kept breaking. Eventually I gave up and walked home. That night I noticed something new. There were 3 crows perched on the fence behind the orchard. Watching my window, I didn't feel scared. Not exactly. More observed. Like I was part of something now. Whether I understood it or not didn't seem to matter. Uncle Di didn't mention anything. He was too busy complaining about the neighbor's cows escaping again. I helped him repair the outer gate, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Lowry. Who was she? Why did she seem so comfortable with the birds? And what did she mean they remembered me? That evening, just before bed, I went to my window. 1 crow remained. It sat perfectly still even as the wind tugged at the branches. I whispered goodnight. It blinked once, then flew away into the darkness. The next day would bring more answers, or at least more questions disguised as answers. But for now I slept deeply, the sound of wings rustling through my dreams. I spent the whole morning pretending not to think about her. I helped Uncle Di stack hay into the loft, then fetched a pail of water from the old pump near the orchard. But every time I paused, even for a breath, my thoughts went right back to the clearing, to Lowry, to the way the crows moved around her like they were tethered to her presence. After lunch, Uncle Di dozed off in the chair near the fireplace, a newspaper draped across his chest. I took the chance to slip away again. I told myself I wouldn't go too far, just enough to see if she'd show up again. Maybe she wasn't even real. Maybe she was just some strange summer dream that came with the smell of moss and the buzz of dragonflies. But part of me knew she'd be there. The path behind the barn looked more worn now, like someone or something had been passing through regularly. I ducked under the wire fence and let the trees swallow me again. It was cooler today, and the leaves had that rustling whisper like they were trying to talk to each other about me. I walked carefully, following the same route until I reached the grove. She wasn't there, but a crow was. It hopped along the ground and stopped just ahead of me, turning its head slightly like it was waiting. Then it let out a low, short caw and started walking, not flying, but walking deeper into the woods. Every few steps it would pause to make sure I was still behind it. I followed. The trees became denser, the light dimmer, and just when I started to wonder if I'd gotten myself into trouble, I saw a faint clearing up ahead. Not the same one as before. This one had a little hill, a few leaning birch trees, and at the base of the hill, tucked between roots, a flat stone that looked almost like a bench. Laurie was sitting on it, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes watching me approach like she'd known I was coming all along. "You brought your sketchbook," she said. I glanced down and realized I had almost without thinking. It was tucked under my arm. "Yeah," I replied, "in case you wanted to see." She didn't answer. Instead, she patted the stone beside her. I hesitated only a second, then sat down. The stone was warm, just like the one from before, even though the clearing was shaded and cool. A few crows rustled in the branches above, shifting quietly. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then she asked, "What do you think they say when you're not around?" I blinked. The crows. She nodded, eyes still on the trees. "They talk all the time. Most people don't listen." I smiled a little, trying to play along. Okay then, what do they say about you? She looked at me, then really looked like she was measuring the weight of the question. They say I belong to the trees, she said softly, and that the trees remember more than people do. That gave me goosebumps. I opened my notebook and flipped to a blank page. Can I draw you? I asked, surprising even myself. She didn't smile, but she gave the smallest nod. So I drew. I tried to capture her just as she was sitting there quiet and still, with the crows watching from above. Her hair moved only slightly in the breeze, and her white dress looked like it was made from mist. I focused, hard tongue pressed to the corner of my mouth the way I always did when I drew. When I finished, I turned the notebook toward her. She studied it for a long time. Then, to my surprise, she reached out and traced the edge of her drawn face with one finger. You see more than most, she said. I just like details, I mumbled. She looked toward the treetops. They like you, she said. Who the crows? She nodded. They remember when someone is kind, when someone listens. I wanted to ask more. What did she mean, remember? How long had she been here? Was she always here? But something about the quiet around us made those questions feel loud, intrusive. So I just sat beside her. Eventually, she stood up. Come back tomorrow, she said. And before I could reply, she walked away into the woods, crows following behind her like shadows. I stayed in the clearing a little longer, looking down at my drawing. It didn't feel like just a sketch anymore. It felt like proof. Proof that she existed, that something was happening this summer, something I wasn't supposed to explain, only experience. As I walked back to the house, I noticed that the crow from before was back. It swooped low and perched on the gatepost by the barn. It didn't fly off when I approached. It just looked at me. I stopped and looked right back. Do you remember me? I asked it, half laughing. The bird cawed softly. That night I dreamed of feathers drifting through tall trees and voices I didn't quite understand whispering in a language I couldn't name. And in the middle of the dream I heard Lowry's voice clear as day. Not everything forgotten is gone. The crows were everywhere the next day. Not in a frightening way, not like a scene from a movie, but in a way that made me feel like they were part of the place now, like pieces of furniture or smoke curling from a chimney. One sat on the roof's edge when I stepped outside with my boots untied. Another pecked calmly at the soil near the garden hose. A third, maybe the same one that had perched by the barn yesterday, hopped onto the wooden fence and stared at me while I ate toast. Uncle Di didn't seem to notice them, or if he did, he didn't find anything odd about it. He just grumbled about how dry the soil was and how the pump needed fixing again. But I knew something had changed. I didn't go to the woods right away. Part of me was worried I'd seem too eager, like I'd spook her somehow. So I walked around the pasture for a bit, pretending I was looking for mushrooms. A few crows followed, always staying just close enough for me to notice, but not so close I could reach out. When the afternoon sun softened and the light turned golden, I finally made my way past the barbed fence again. This time the path felt almost welcoming. The leaves above dappled the dirt trail in patches of warmth. I could hear wind moving through the branches and something that sounded like quiet singing, though I couldn't tell from where. I returned to the clearing with the stone bench. She wasn't there. Instead, there were 5 crows waiting. One on the bench, 3 in the trees, and one perched right in the center of the spiral stone like a guardian. I stepped into the circle, slowly watching them. None of them moved. Then I heard footsteps. Lori emerged from the trees on the other side of the grove, carrying something in her hands. As she approached, I saw it was a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She stopped a few feet from me and knelt down by the spiral stone. I brought something for you, she said gently, unwrapping the bundle. Inside was a feather. Not a regular crow feather, this one shimmered strangely in the light, with subtle blues and silvers like oil on water. Next to it was a tiny carved bird made of wood barely the size of my thumb. "I made this when I was little," she said. "And the feather, it came from one who remembers more than most." I knelt beside her, unsure what to say. I wasn't used to people giving me things, especially not something that felt this sacred. "Thank you," I whispered. She looked at me. "They're watching over you now." I almost laughed, but something in her tone made me stop. She wasn't joking. Laurie walked to the edge of the clearing and motioned for me to follow. "There's more I want to show you." We passed under tangled boughs and over roots that felt almost hand-placed, like a winding staircase designed by nature. The crows flitted ahead of us like tour guides stopping to look back as if to make sure we were keeping up. Eventually we came to a break in the trees where the land dropped into a shallow valley. Below us was a field I'd never seen before, overgrown and silent, with a few leaning fence posts that looked more like bones than wood. In the middle stood a tree, enormous, its branches twisted like smoke, and its trunk was split near the base, forming a kind of hollow. "That's where I was born," she said quietly. I turned to look at her, thinking I'd misheard. "In a storm. My mother said the crows brought her there when the house was flooded. Said they watched over her the whole time." "That's real?" I asked. Lowry nodded slowly. "As real as anything else." We sat on a fallen log at the top of the hill, watching the wind ripple the grass below. The crows settled into nearby branches, some perching just above us, their wings rustling softly like dry paper. "What about your family now?" I asked. "Do they live here too?" She didn't answer at first. Then she said, "Not anymore." I wanted to ask more, but the look in her eyes told me not to. Instead, she said, "Do you want to see where they rest?" I didn't know what I expected. Maybe a cemetery or a stone marker. But she led me to a smaller clearing I'd somehow never passed before. There, nestled under the shadow of a willow, were 3 simple wooden posts. No names, no dates. Just symbols carved into the wood, a spiral, a feather, and a wave. "They're not buried there," she said, "but it's where they remember." The crows circled once above the trees, then vanished into the sky, leaving only silence. We walked back slowly, taking a longer route through the woods. At one point, she reached out and took my hand, not in a romantic way, just a quiet grounding gesture, like she wanted to make sure I wouldn't disappear. When we got back to the spiral stone, she stopped. "Next time, bring something of yours," she said. "Something you don't mind giving up." "Why?" "So they'll know your name." I didn't ask who they were. That night there were 6 crows on the fence. One tapped on the window with its beak once, then flew away. I placed the carved bird and feather beside my bed, and I dreamt of trees that whispered in languages I'd never heard, of faces watching from branches, and a girl walking barefoot through fog. The orchard felt different the next morning. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything quieter, as if the world's holding its breath. I stood by the fence, holding a small item in my pocket, something Laurie had asked for, something of mine, something I didn't mind giving up. It had taken me most of the night to decide, but I eventually chose my compass. It wasn't anything fancy, just a plastic one I'd won in a cereal box, but I'd carried it for years. I used to imagine it would guide me if I ever got lost in the woods or whisked away on some grand adventure. Now that seemed oddly appropriate. Uncle Di was tinkering with the old tractor again and barely looked up as I slipped into the trees. The crows were already waiting. One flew low above my head as I crossed the barbed wire, then disappeared into the canopy ahead. The path by now felt like my own secret hallway. My boots knew the dips and roots instinctively. When I reached the spiral stone, I paused. It still amazed me how the clearing always looked exactly the same, like it had existed in its perfect form long before I'd ever arrived. Laurie was already there, sitting cross-legged on the stone bench. "You brought it?" she asked without looking up. I nodded and pulled the compass from my pocket, cradling it in my palm like it might vanish if I gripped too tight. I crossed the circle, slowly aware of the crows gathering above their wings, shifting like a soft tide. Lowry stood and held out her hand. I placed the compass into her open palm. Her fingers closed around it like it was something precious, something sacred. "They'll know you now," she whispered. "You've given them a direction." I didn't understand it, not fully, but I nodded anyway. She turned toward the spiral stone, knelt, and placed the compass gently at its center. The moment she let go, the wind shifted just a little. The leaves above us rustled in a slow spiral motion, like a signal passed from tree to tree. I felt something then. Not cold, not warm either, just present. A hush settled over the clearing, thick enough that I held my breath. Then one by one, the crows began to caw. Not loudly, soft, low murmurs like a chant. They weren't alarmed. It was almost reverent. Lowry stood and faced me. "They remember your face now. That matters." I swallowed. "Why does it matter?" "Because there's more to see," she said. "And not all paths are visible unless you've been accepted." I should have been confused. I probably was. But it didn't feel strange in that moment. It felt like I was walking deeper into a story that had already started without me, one I was now becoming part of. She motioned for me to follow, and we left the clearing, heading in a direction I hadn't taken before. The forest here was thicker, the trees older, twisted with moss, and half-fallen ivy-covered trunks. It felt like walking into a forgotten chapter of a book. Eventually, the ground sloped downward and the trees opened up to reveal a shallow pond tucked in a hollow. It was silent. Not still, there was the occasional ripple, but completely silent. No frogs, no insects, not even birdsong. Laurie knelt at the edge and pointed. "This pond only appears when it's remembered. Most summers it dries up, but when someone gives something to the crows, it returns. It's like a mirror for forgotten things." I stepped closer and looked down. The surface of the pond reflected the sky in a way that didn't make sense. There were stars in the water, but the sky above us was dull and gray. And then I saw something else. My reflection, but different. I was older, taller, wearing clothes I didn't own yet. And there beside my reflection was Lowry, unchanged. I blinked. Gone. I looked at her. "Did you see that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she dipped one hand into the pond and pulled out a small, water-smoothed object, an old brass key, its edges rusted and worn. "This belonged to my brother," she said quietly, "before he disappeared." Her voice was calm, but I heard something beneath it, a kind of ache, a heaviness she kept hidden beneath layers of quiet. "What happened to him?" I asked. She turned the key over in her hand. "He followed the wrong sound." Not every voice in the woods is kind. Some things whisper lies. A crow landed beside her as if to punctuate the warning. She placed the key on the moss beside the pond and stood. "He wasn't ready. He didn't offer anything first. He came here wanting answers without leaving anything behind." I nodded, feeling the weight of my compass back in the clearing. We sat beside the pond for a long while, saying nothing, watching the strange reflection ripple and fade with the breeze. Eventually, Lowry stood again. "We should head back." As we walked, she said, "Tomorrow will be different. Things will begin to shift, but you'll understand. You're listening." When we reached the clearing, the spiral stone was empty again. My compass was gone. She didn't say where it had gone, and I didn't ask. That night, I drew the pond in my notebook as best I could. I used a silver pencil I found in the back of my drawer, one I hadn't touched since I was 6. As I shaded the reflection, I noticed something odd in the drawing. Lowry was already there beside me, even though I hadn't meant to include her. A chill moved through me, not fear, but something deeper. Like I was remembering something I hadn't lived yet. When I looked out my window, there were more crows now, 9, and they were all facing the house. It started raining sometime after midnight. I woke to the rhythmic tapping of drops against the old roof tiles and the softer patter against my window pane. The sky was still dark, but I could tell it was nearing morning. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The crows were gone. Not a single one. I didn't know why that made my stomach twist a little. They had become a part of the place, like shadows that never quite disappeared. Their absence made everything feel exposed. Downstairs, Uncle Di was already awake, sipping tea in the kitchen and listening to the same radio broadcast he always did. Sheep prices, weather, a missing dog. He didn't notice how quiet I was, or maybe he did and chalked it up to that moody age. The rain didn't let up all morning. It just got softer, thinner, like it was trying not to be noticed. After lunch, I wandered upstairs, searching for something to distract myself. I'd already read all the books I brought, and sketching didn't feel right without the crows. My eyes drifted toward the narrow wooden staircase that led to the attic. I'd only been up there once, and even then only briefly when Uncle Di was looking for an old toolbox. He kept the attic door shut tight most of the time, and the way the hinges groaned made it feel like the house itself didn't want it opened. But today something told me I should go. I crept up the stairs, one hand trailing along the faded wallpaper. The attic door opened slowly, and a small cloud of dust floated out to greet me. The air smelled like old wool, dried leaves, and a hint of mothballs. Light filtered in through a round window at the far end, painting the room in soft gray and gold. Boxes were stacked high, some labeled in shaky handwriting: jars, tools, keepsakes. And then in the far corner, beneath a heavy quilt, something larger, a trunk. I stepped carefully across the creaky floorboards and knelt beside it. The latch wasn't locked, just stiff with age. It opened with a soft pop, and the smell of cedar and thyme spilled out. Inside there were books, stacks of them with cracked spines and yellowed pages. Beneath them, loose photographs in envelopes, old coins, and one small cloth-bound notebook tied shut with string. I untied the string. The first few pages were blank. Then came words handwritten in an uneven scrawl. Not my uncle's. They looked older, childlike. The entries weren't dated, but the first line stuck with me. I saw the girl again today. She told me the trees remember things I've forgotten. I kept reading. The entries mentioned the woods, the spiral stone, the pond, crows, a girl named Lowry, and then Safrain discerned. He followed her once into the water, said he could hear voices under the surface. He never came back. We left a marker under the willow. She said that's where they'll return if the crows allow it. I froze. The entries grew more chaotic after that, scratched out lines, pages torn. But one last note remained at the end of the book. Don't follow the singing, not unless she says it's safe. I sat back, heart tapping nervously in my chest. The rain had stopped, or maybe I just stopped noticing it. I tucked the notebook under my arm and crept back downstairs. Uncle Di was outside fiddling with a wheelbarrow, so I slipped past him and out toward the trees again. The forest was wet and glistening, the path muddy beneath my boots. I followed it quickly, ducking under branches, heavy with water droplets, until I reached the spiral stone. It was empty. No compass, no feathers, no Lowry. I waited and waited. The crows didn't come. Eventually I stood and turned back toward the path. But before I left the clearing, I heard something soft, melodic, barely audible. Singing. It was coming from deeper in the woods, past where I'd ever gone. My breath caught in my throat. Don't follow the singing, not unless she says it's safe. But the voice was beautiful, sad, familiar. I stood frozen for a long moment. Then I turned slowly and backed away from the sound. Back at the house, I wiped the mud from my boots, slid the attic notebook beneath my mattress, and tried to act normal. But everything felt different now. That night, the crows returned. Every single one of them perched on the orchard fence again, except now there were 12. And this time one of them was holding something in its beak. A ribbon, pale, faded, the same color as the sash tied around Lowry's waist the first day I saw her. The ribbon was still there the next morning. It hung from the fence post like a flag barely moving in the breeze. Pale blue, soft with age, and knotted near one end, like it had been pulled loose during a struggle, or maybe tied there on purpose. The crow that brought it was gone, but its message, whatever it was, remained. I didn't touch it. I just stood in the damp grass for a while, watching it sway, trying to decide what to feel. I was used to the strangeness by now, the crows, the hidden grove, Lowry herself. But something about that ribbon made everything feel heavier, more urgent. At breakfast, Uncle Di noticed I was distracted. He didn't ask why, just muttered something about the sheep getting jittery overnight and went out to fix a hole in the fence. I waited until he was out of sight before slipping back upstairs. I grabbed the notebook from beneath my mattress, the attic one, the one that had mentioned him, the boy who never came back. Lowry's brother. I flipped through the pages again, slower this time, looking for something I might have missed. And I found it. Folded tightly between two pages was a rough sketch, a map hand-drawn in pencil, almost childlike in its simplicity. Trees, paths, a spiral marked in the center. But there was something else, a second spiral further north, deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone. It was labeled only with one word: mirror. I traced the path with my finger, committing it to memory. Then I folded the notebook and tucked it into my coat pocket before heading back out. The sky was clearer now, but the air still smelled like last night's rain. The crows watched me from their usual places, some on the roof, others along the orchard fence. But they didn't follow this time, not yet. I reached the familiar clearing past the spiral stone and continued deeper into the woods. The path wasn't clear like the others had been. I had to push aside branches and climb over tangled roots. The trees here were taller, older. The light shifted strangely through the canopy, flickering, as if something was pacing just above me. I kept walking. Eventually I found it. A second spiral, smaller, overgrown with moss, barely visible beneath the ivy. But it was there, just like the map. And beside it, a stone bench. Not carved, but shaped by nature. A place to sit, a place to wait. I stepped into the spiral and sat down. Minutes passed. Then soft footsteps on wet earth. Lowry, she didn't speak at first. She just walked around the outer edge of the spiral, tracing her fingers along the moss as she moved. The crows began to gather in the trees above, silent as ever. I thought something had happened to you, I said quietly. She nodded. I had to be somewhere. Somewhere they don't usually let me go. I didn't ask what they meant. She stopped and looked at me. You found the notebook. I pulled it out slowly and handed it to her. She didn't open it, just rested her palm on the cover like she was greeting an old friend. That was his, she said, my brother's. What happened to him? Her eyes didn't meet mine. He heard the singing before he was ready, before they remembered him. There was a silence, heavy but not empty. He followed it to the mirror pond, thought he could find what was missing, thought he could bring her back. Her. Lowry nodded. Our mother. I let that sink in. And did he? She shook her head. The pond shows you what you want most, but it doesn't give. It only reflects. He walked into it, thought he saw her on the other side. I swallowed, and he never came back. Only in dreams, she said. Sometimes I hear him calling, but it's like an echo without a mouth. We sat in silence again. Finally, I said, then why show me this place? Why lead me deeper? Laurie looked at me, and this time her expression was different. Not mysterious, not distant, just human. A girl who had lost something and was trying to make sense of it. Because you listen, she said, and because I think maybe the crows want you to see what's next. I didn't know what next meant, but I nodded. She stood brushed moss from her dress and pointed toward a narrow path behind the second spiral. Tomorrow, she said, we follow the feathers. Then she walked away, vanishing between the trees like mist in morning sun. When I returned to the orchard, the ribbon was gone. And that night I dreamed of the mirror pond again. Only this time I didn't see myself. I saw someone else older, soaked in rain, standing in the water and reaching for something just out of view. I woke just before dawn, my room bathed in a pale blue glow. The dream clung to me like fog images of the pond, of that figure in the water, reaching, always reaching for something unseen. I got dressed slowly, still half trapped in that lingering feeling between sleep and wakefulness. When I stepped outside, the orchard was covered in dew. Every blade of grass shimmered, and along the fence line, stretching like a breadcrumb trail, were feathers. Not crow feathers, white, soft and downy, like they'd fallen from something that wasn't quite bird. They looked out of place, sacred somehow. I followed them, past the barn, through the orchard gate, across the pasture where the sheep hadn't yet stirred. The trail curved toward the woods and disappeared beneath the trees. No crows followed. No Lowry waited. I hesitated at the fence line. Then I ducked beneath the wire and stepped into the shade. The forest felt quieter than usual, like even the trees were holding their breath. I followed the feathers deeper, the soft tufts spaced just enough apart to make me keep looking, scanning the mossy ground and bramble-covered roots. After some time, I reached the second spiral. Lowry was already there. She sat cross-legged at the center of it, eyes closed, palms resting face up on her knees. For a moment, I wondered if she was asleep, but as I stepped closer, her voice broke the silence. "They've agreed." I stopped. "Who?" She opened her eyes slowly, calmly. "The crows, the trees, the watchers. They've been waiting for someone to carry a memory." I blinked. A memory. She stood and brushed the damp leaves from her skirt. "This place, this forest, it doesn't forget, but sometimes it needs help remembering. That's what we do. That's what I do." She looked up at the canopy, her face lit by beams of filtered gold light. "And now you too." I didn't fully understand, but I didn't interrupt. Her voice was softer than usual, not mysterious, just thoughtful. She pointed to the narrow trail behind the second spiral, the one she'd shown me yesterday. "We're going there today, but not as visitors." I followed her without speaking. The path twisted through brambles and hollow logs, leading us farther than I'd ever gone. The ground rose gently, and the trees began to change, taller, yes, but also more awake. Their bark was smoother and in some places etched with shapes, spirals, feathers, eyes. They weren't carvings, they looked grown. We arrived at a small glade. In the center stood a stone arch, just taller than me, covered in lichen and vines. Beneath it, the pond. Not the first one, not the mirror pond. This one was still dark and perfectly round, like the earth had opened its eye and chosen to watch the sky. Lowry stood at the edge. "This is where they bring what must be remembered. It's not for seeing, it's for giving." I glanced around. No birds, no wind, just the sound of water lapping gently against the mossy edge. Lori reached into the satchel slung across her shoulder and pulled out something small. My compass. She hadn't returned it. I hadn't asked. But now she cupped it in her hand, holding it out to me. "They accepted your offering, but now you must choose to release it." I stepped forward and took the compass. It felt lighter somehow, as though something inside had shifted. "What happens if I do?" I asked. Laurie looked at me with something between sadness and hope. "It becomes part of the forest. It becomes part of the memory." I stared at the still surface of the pond. Then slowly I bent down and lowered the compass into the water. The moment it touched, ripples spread outward, slow, deliberate, like time itself was reacting. A soft chime echoed through the glade, though there were no bells. No wind. And then the forest exhaled. I didn't hear it. I felt it. A release. A shift. like some invisible tension had been waiting to let go. Lowry knelt beside me. "Now it will remember you," she said. "What if I forget?" She smiled gently. "You won't, not completely. Even forgotten things leave a shape behind." We sat in silence for a long while. Eventually she whispered, "They're calling me again. Soon I won't be able to come here." I turned to her, heart tightening. "Why?" "They shift in cycles," she said, eyes distant, "like seasons. I'm only part of this one. When the wind changes, someone else comes. Someone else listens." I didn't know what to say. She placed her hand on mine. "But you'll remember." And with that, she stood and walked into the trees, her figure swallowed by green light and shadow. I sat by the pond until the light began to dim the sun, retreating behind thickening clouds. When I finally walked back through the woods, I noticed the feathers were gone, but the crows had returned. They watched from the trees, silent and still. And when I reached the edge of the orchard, one flew low across the field, dropping something small into the grass ahead of me. A single page from the attic notebook. The words were smeared, but I could still read them. "When she leaves, the trees keep singing, quiet, but always." The house felt heavier that evening. Not dark, not ominous, just full of silence, of things unsaid, of pages missing from a notebook I hadn't realized had more to tell. I tucked the feathered page inside my sketchbook and went about the evening like normal supper with Uncle Di, helping bring in the laundry that had been left to dry on the covered porch, sweeping the kitchen floor even though it didn't really need it. He didn't ask about the woods and I didn't bring them up, but he did glance at me once when I walked past with the broom. "You've been different lately," he muttered. Not accusing, just noticing. I paused. "How so?" He shrugged. "Quieter. Like you're listening to something I can't hear." I didn't answer, not really sure I could. That night as I lay in bed, I thought about what Larry had said, "I'm only part of the season." It echoed through me, bouncing off the walls of my chest. I stared up at the ceiling and imagined the forest breathing, not just with wind, but with memory, with longing, with quiet eyes in the trees. I fell asleep without realizing it. The attic notebook opened beside me, the ribbon tucked in its center. And again I dreamed. But this dream wasn't like the others. There were no mirror ponds, no spirals, no crows, just the orchard. In the dream, I was standing in the tall grass at dusk. Fireflies hovered low, blinking in lazy rhythms. And in the distance, just at the edge of the trees, stood Lowry. She didn't speak, just held her hand out. I walked to her. When I reached her, she pressed something small into my palm. I looked down. It was the carved bird she'd once given me, but now it was cracked, split right down the middle. I looked up, but she was gone. I woke with a jolt, fingers clenched tight around air. The morning light was soft, a little golden. I sat up groggy and ran a hand through my hair. My room felt normal again, dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the smell of old wood and summer air drifting through the open window. But then I noticed something on the windowsill, a single white feather. I picked it up carefully and turned it over in my hand. It shimmered faintly in the light. The same kind as yesterday, same softness, same whisper of something not entirely natural. A breeze moved through the window, and I heard it. Soft, almost too soft to notice. Singing, not the haunting kind I'd been warned about. This was different, like a lullaby hummed by someone far away. Sad, beautiful, familiar. It wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from the attic. I froze. The attic door had been closed for weeks, ever since I found the notebook. But now it creaked slightly open, just a sliver. I stepped out of bed. My feet moved without thinking across the floor, up the narrow stairwell, the boards groaning under my weight. The singing grew clearer. Not words, just melody. Notes shaped like memories. The attic was just as I'd left it, except the trunk. It was open again. Inside, no books, no coins, no ribbon. Only the carved bird. Whole, not cracked, not aged, just whole. And beside it, something else. A page. Fresh. As if written last night. The ink still damp in some places. It read, "You remembered, that's enough." And beneath that, in smaller writing, "Some seasons return." I sat in the attic for a long time, holding the bird, listening to the silence, letting the story settle into my bones. I didn't go back to the woods that day, or the next. Lowry didn't return. The spiral was empty. But the trees, they still whispered when the wind was right. The crows still watched from the barn roof. And some mornings I'd find feathers leading nowhere in particular, just reminders, like footprints in snow after the snow has melted. And once, just once, I heard the low hum of that lullaby again carried on a summer breeze. This time I hummed it back. Weeks passed. Summer ripened and began to soften the way it always does near the end. The grass in the orchard turned a little golden at the edges, and the apples hung heavier on the trees. The sheep moved slower. Even the crows seemed more contemplative, quieter in their watchfulness. I didn't go to the woods as often anymore. It wasn't that I didn't want to. It was more like they didn't call to me the same way. The spiral stone remained moss-covered and silent. The carved symbols on the trees had faded slightly, or maybe I had just learned to stop looking so hard, and Lowry never returned. But the memory of her was woven into everything, into the way the wind moved through the tall grass, into the space between crow calls, into the shimmer of pond water when I walked the orchard's edge. I didn't need to see her anymore to feel she was still there. One morning near the end of August, I found something waiting on the porch. It wasn't a feather or a carved bird or a ribbon. It was a letter, folded in thirds, no name on the front, just a spiral drawn in graphite. I opened it slowly, unsure what I hoped it would say. There was only one line. "You carried it well. That's all they ever ask." No signature, but I knew. I read it 3 times before tucking it into the attic notebook right where the map had once been. It felt like a full circle closing, even if I didn't quite understand the geometry of it all. Later that afternoon, Uncle Di asked if I wanted to help him repair the garden wall. I said yes. As we worked, he handed me a hammer and said offhandedly, "Saw you out there near the trees again this morning." I hesitated. "Yeah. You remind me of your mother," he said, not looking up. "She used to talk to the birds too." I blinked. "She did." He nodded once. "Said they remembered things the wind forgot." That was all he said. He never brought it up again. But something about it stayed with me. That night, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long over the orchard, I sat in my room with my sketchbook open on my lap. I flipped through the pages, slowly drawings of crows, the spiral stones, the first portrait I'd made of Lowry. My fingers paused on that one. She looked right at me through the lines in graphite, as if she still had something left to say. So I drew one more picture, not of her, of the forest, of the grove, of the feeling. I didn't need a reference, I just remembered. When I was finished, I wrote one sentence beneath it. "Even forgotten things leave a shape behind." I left the drawing on the windowsill that night, not expecting anything to happen. But in the morning it was gone. In its place was a single feather, black, tipped with silver. The kind I'd seen only once before. I smiled and didn't say a word to anyone. Some stories don't end loudly. They don't crash like waves or explode like fireworks. Some stories end the way dusk settles across an orchard, slowly, softly, almost imperceptibly, like a feather falling through twilight. And maybe that's what this summer was for me. Not a beginning or an end, just a space in between. A place where things remembered themselves again. Where a girl in a white dress and a forest full of quiet eyes reminded me that not everything needs to be understood to be true. Sometimes it's enough to listen, to walk the path, to give something small like a compass or a ribbon or a moment of your time, and let it echo into something much bigger than you. As the seasons shift and the leaves begin to curl at the edges, I find myself humming that same strange lullaby. Not because I heard it, but because it lives somewhere now, tucked inside the folds of memory and moss. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a quiet wood, and the trees seem to know your name, step carefully. Listen more than you speak. And if the crows follow you, let them. It only means they remember. And if they remember, then part of you is already home. Good night, friend. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.